Thank you, Ben. Um, as he mentioned, my name's Ian Edmondson. I'm founder and MD of my own small consultancy, Legacy Delivery. And the title of this session is Defining Event Impacts and Promoting Positive Outcomes. As Ben mentioned, this session is a little different in the sense that it's a workshop, and we call it that because it dives into a little bit of the detail, and specifically on the topic of common indicators for measuring the impacts that we all want to achieve from events. So, as we've heard in many of the other panel sessions, there are a need for demonstrating return on investment across a much wider agenda, not just mega events. And what I will do today is take you through a short presentation of the report that was published by ASWAF in October this year, and it builds on a session we held at Host City in 2020, the virtual Host City, where we talked about the consultation work that was going on at the time and the framework that was being developed from that work. At the end of this next 10 minutes or so, you'll then get into a detailed discussion on the applicability of these common indicators with a panelist, and that panel will consist of Thomas Lund, General Secretary of the Badminton World Federation, Paul Bristow, co-founder and MD of the European Championships, which will be held in Munich next year, Élise Smith, Senior Programme Officer from part of the major sport event coordination team at Sport Canada, and Joel Lavery from Strategic Lead for Major Sporting Events from West Midlands Growth Company. But as I mentioned, I'll take you through the slides to demonstrate a little bit about the detail that's contained within what I have here as a hard copy version of the report. Some of you may have seen it. I can share in the chat a link to it as we get further into the workshop. But to dive straight in, the work is been born out of consultation with four different segments of the host community. One is rights holders, the international federations, not just the Summer Olympic federations that were part of the ASWAF network that commissioned the report, but also winter federations, some private events themselves. Then the host community, particularly linked to the International Association of Event Hosts and some of their members that are named on the screen there. And then also the specialists in the industry, the consultancies, research organizations that are busy doing evaluation work now, and also academics. So some of the universities, have done many years of in-depth studies and understand the theory to lead to some of these tangible outcomes that are the sorts of topic of conversation we've had today. The report has an executive summary up front and specifically references the benefits of acting or measuring things in a consistent way, and that can include being more cost effective, but also help us all deliver on meaningful change. It also references links to other international guidance, and specifically OECD work that was signed by sports ministers across the world in 2018 on global events for local development. There's also, as a consequence of that work, been further work done and is being done now with the IOC and with other institutions, including the Commonwealth Secretariat, to demonstrate how indicators can link to the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So what we have in this report is about 70 pages of detailed explanation of specific indicators. But those indicators are deliberately broad and meant to include as much as possible, based on objectives about why people would like to host events. So this framework isn't perfect. It doesn't necessarily reflect exactly what every government or host city may aim to achieve, but it covers the broad areas that you see down the left-hand side, and on the right-hand side, the broad outcomes that people might like to see coming from events, such as future tourism as a result of the image value, such as global citizenship, making a difference to things like climate change that we've heard about in the previous sessions, and some of those social impacts, like making a difference to community or having people become more healthy and mentally and physically. So in the middle, you see a whole list of areas, 22 different areas where an event can make a difference. And any expert in evaluation will tell you that the things that you should evaluate are the reasons, your objectives. Up front, you should understand your reasons, and secondly, understand what difference your intervention, your event makes. So the model recognizes that you need to measure the things that you're doing to make a difference. Actually, how that makes a difference in the long term may be costly, may be more expensive, but at the very basic level, you should at least measure what you're doing to try and make a difference. So in this guidance, you'll see a detailed explanation about the terminology of input, output, and outcome key performance indicators. And there are 30 input KPIs described in the report, 50 output KPIs described, and 10 outcome KPIs described. So if you imagine the life cycle of an event from the days that you're first considering it, or you decide to host an event, it could be months or years before holding the event in the middle of this diagram, and actually change may happen, in the months or years after as a consequence of the event as well. So the terminology of input KPIs generally are at the beginning of that journey, output KPIs in the middle when the event happens, and outcome KPIs in the long term. So, as I mentioned before, in the report, each of these 80 different KPIs is described and clearly demonstrating which of the UN Sustainable Development Goals they are linked to. And some of that link may be, quite hard to establish, but it's very clear to state exactly which ones an event makes a difference to. Also then, in terms of practical use, there's a clear description here to say, identify your own objectives for your own event. Your event may be small, you may not have a large research budget, you may only be measuring things as a team internally. But if you understand the difference you're trying to make and understand your target audiences, then you can pick from the menu that's contained in the report what KPIs are relevant to you. And then use the data gathering to inform what you do, and ultimately share some of that results so that people can see the value and potentially build on the success that you may have had in your own first edition of an event. So very quickly, I flash up a few of the bit of the detail. This is the economic area, and it shows some of the building blocks of economic impact that many people calculate, like bed nights, like number of spectators that are visiting, number of participants that are visiting. This is the image area. And again, depending on what you're measuring, if you're measuring sort of the difference to, the brand value of your destination, then there may be a few component parts that might make a difference within that, whether that's the press coverage, the social media, the digital broadcast, or the attitudes of viewers. This is the social area. And again, come in quite a number of different ways, including volunteering and activation in the city about. So if you are measuring up front that you have a plan to do something about this, then you know when you come to measure it, who is it you want to understand, has it made a difference to? Similarly, in sport, if you want to try and make a difference to a segment of the population that has become more involved to have more healthy lifestyle, then understanding that up front means that you're likely to be able to demonstrate a tangible difference in the long term. And finally, on the last point, the example there refers to climate change. It might be that you may or may not have a major program to get to net zero, but if you a building block of that right up front is understanding your carbon footprint. So one of the input KPIs there is about, is there a measurement or an estimation of carbon footprint in place at the start? So just flicking through a couple of pages, these are screenshots from the report, just to show you the type of detail that's included. And there are boxes I highlight there to say where specialist terminology is used, or specialist expertise maybe needed to be called in to measure some of these things. There are, as I mentioned, detailed descriptions of the SDG relevant to that area, but also the individual SDG target under the overall umbrella, and in some cases the individual SDG indicators. This is another level of detail that exists for each of the 17 UN Sustainable Development Goals. Then there's a page for each of the groupings of KPIs like this, and you'll see a description, a short description of the KPI and when you should measure it on that lifetime of the event life cycle, and for that might be after the event, or it might be prior to the event. And in some cases, as you can see there, there is an example question and an example answer structure that's given, so that you can take the wording used there and the answer structure and then know how to compare it with another event that you may see using the same way of measuring that KPI. There are also some specific references to best practice. In this case, the Sustainable Procurement Code. There's an IOC guidance on what a sustainable procurement code should look like, and there's a specific reference, and in the PDF version there's a link that will take you directly to some of that guidance. And finally, in the red at the bottom here, there's some snapshots of experience from the events that were involved in the gathering of this this report, to say, well, typically you might expect there to be this range of volunteers in an event of this sort of size. So where possible, that's been scattered into the report alongside some specific case studies of how events have addressed some of these areas in the framework. So finally, right at the end, there's a summary list of all of those 80 KPIs. They're given a specific reference code and a reference to some wider work about the UN SDGs and how sport contributes to that, which I think may become more prevalent, more commonly used for sport as a whole, not just for sport events. So, my recommendation to anybody watching this is print off those that summary pages. If necessary, use that in a description for your teams or for your research providers, and say, we'd like you to measure these KPIs because they are relevant to us, and select the relevant ones, and you can go to the individual reference code. So the final thing to say is that the ASWAF, the Summer Olympic Federations, and the International Association of Event Hosts earlier this year both have been involved in this piece of work, have committed to a memorandum of understanding to say, will promote the adoption of these KPIs. It doesn't mean that everybody has to measure them all, but we recommend that people do start measuring these areas because they will be relevant and useful in the measurement of some of these wider outcomes in the years to come. So that ends the presentation side of it. Hopefully you've been able to follow some of that. As I said, I'll share the link in the chat if I can for anybody that hasn't seen the report. But I'll introduce now our panelists. First of all, Thomas Lund, General Secretary of Badminton World Federation. Thomas was at the heart of the commissioning of this work back in March 2020 as part of the commercial advisory group. So and knows the reason for doing it, but he also has a view on what's practical and what's useful in his own federation. So just before I hand over to Thomas, let me encourage everybody, if you can, add comments in the chat. I will monitor that and be on top of it as we go along. So Thomas, to you first, your comments on the background and how applicable you see it as being now.
Thanks, Iain, and first of all, congratulations for having driven this process to put together this events impact report. I mean, I've been so fortunate, together with other IF colleagues and other stakeholders, to have been providing some input, but obviously you've been kind of pulling it all together. I think to me, this impact report, and that was, I guess, also the intention of it, that it's an important and very practical tool to try and describe and help, I would say, educate all stakeholders around events, around all the various possible outcomes and deliverables that can be achieved when hosting an event. Right holders, hosts, local government, sports federation, and I mean the general community as well. Huh? So, I mean, I think it does help highlight a very wide range of properties, and it does then help create this terminology, shared terminology and methodology between all stakeholders. And I think at the end of the day, it helps us have a better dialogue between all stakeholders to get into the deep dive into an event on what is it we want to achieve from the event, what is it the actual outcomes, and being able to measure it afterwards. I mean, it's clearly key to be able to have a dialogue around it as a rights owner, and that's the side of the table I come from. It's really important to have an overview of what is it the event actually, what are the outcomes of the event. And from there, then to develop the strategy that you want to set up on how you want to position your event. And I think this shared methodology, when we talk together across all the different stakeholders in this environment, will help that dialogue. I think, I mean, it's obviously important, and when you look at all of these various different outcomes and impact parameters, that I think it's important to say for a sport event, in my view, that the core is the sport. The core is the sport event, and that is able to attract the excitement, entertainment. The entertainment factor is important for spectators, for fans, for participants, broadcasters, media, and so on. So I think that's always the first thing, at least I look at and say we do need to get this event across as a sporting event and attract all of those key values that lie within the sport and that core thing. But clearly there's so many other things that sport events can do, and I think the report then kind of widen your view and the horizon on what is it this event can do beyond what the sport will do immediately in terms of entertaining and creating spectator excitement. So, and that's what I think is then the basis for us to be able to deliver and develop a better product of our event, and also to have a dialogue with the ones that we would like to attract, hosting more events, the events host around the world, and also try to link into their strategies and thereby come together in achieving the goals. I think there's very few events that will do everything that this report outlines. I think you said it yourself, Iain, that I don't think any event, maybe only a few, will get close to doing everything, but it does actually give a very broad view on what sport events or other events can actually do for you. So I think it's, as I said, it's going to contribute hopefully to a better understanding around the width of different types of events impacts, and help stakeholders understand the whole holistic nature of how events can be used to achieve many different objectives, from the basic excitement of going to a sport event and creating economic impact to a wider range of promotion, long-term social sustainability factors that I think sport events can do as well. So that's kind of my first take at it, Iain, in terms of what this report will do, and I hope many will engage with it.
Thank you, Thomas. Yeah, that's good. A bit of background. Élise, I'll come to you next. From a host government, a host city perspective, I know you've been looking at the idea of trying to quantify how to measure and drive the right behaviours within the system that you oversee in Canada, and we're grateful for having your input into the development of these. So, do you please give us a little bit of background about that and your perspectives on sort of having the common language, the challenge of having a common language as a whole?
Thank you, Iain. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak today. This is the type of work. I mean, this has been at the forefront of what we've done at Sport Canada. We haven't had a model when it came to event hosting, and so over the last couple of years, we've put a lot of effort and work into developing a model. So we've worked, Sport Canada has worked with provinces, we've worked with territories and sport organizations to build a national model to be able to better tell our hosting story. And we've really focused on 4 key things: common vocabulary, as Thomas has mentioned, and you've mentioned as well, Iain, collective path when it comes to pursuing impacts and legacies, consistent model, and ultimately all of this leading to, a more comprehensive hosting story. And so we've come a long way with this model, and it's definitely aligns significantly with a lot of the work that you've done, which is great. And for us, I mean, consistent data gathering has been extremely important in developing this model. And so, in Canada, whether you're hosting a small world championship on the West Coast or, a Commonwealth Games on the East, like, there has to be consistency in the data that we collect if we want to be able to tell our story when it comes to hosting. And so obviously, scale and scope is at the forefront of our thinking. When someone puts their hand up to host something, you always have to know what your capacity is and what you are able to do. And you establish your objectives and you do what you can to achieve those. And so, we've rather, instead of putting all sorts of measures in a vacuum is kind of the expression that we've used, we've really tried to map it out with objectives. So get host societies to really think about, what do you want to achieve? Why do you want to do this in the first place? And map out your objectives and map out your measures from what your objectives are. Because no one puts on an event just to, find out whether or not they can achieve it, to give themselves a pat on the back or something, right? We're doing these things to get positive impacts, immediate, short, medium, and long term. And so, figuring out why we want to do it, figuring out what event makes the most sense for your community is where we believe, you should start. And then we build from there. And if we can have that baseline data across the country in our case, and hopefully, internationally as well, then we'll all be able to tell that story of hosting and why our event was successful. And so our model is a little bit different, perhaps different benefit areas, different frameworks. But at the end of the day, we believe we're trying to achieve the exact same thing that this model is trying to achieve when we talk about common vocabulary, collective consistent path, a consistent model, and ultimately a better story. And so having, no matter what framework we use or other countries or we use internationally, if we have, if we're following the same objectives, I think it'll improve the value of hosting, and we'll all be able to better evaluate whether or not we did achieve our objectives, and what the impacts and legacies are of these events, and why we want to host them in our backyards, and what the positive impacts can be of that.
Thanks, Élise. Paul, I'll come to you next. European Championships coming up fast, having had experience of Glasgow and Berlin. You're a busy man, but you've found time to contribute towards the work that happened over the last 12 or 18 months. So we were grateful for that. And please give us your perspective on why and how you see it helping.
Great. Well, thanks very much, Iain. And firstly, thank you for including us in your consultation process, and congratulations on the report that you and Nasoif have produced. I think it's a fantastic tool and is of great benefit, as Élise says, to a small event organizer or a big event organizer. There's something in there for everybody, and I would encourage anybody listening in today to download the report and read it, and I guarantee you'll learn something from what's written there. It's been important for us to be part of the process, and maybe, Iain, if it's all right with you, I just give a little bit of background on the European Championships for those that don't know who we are and what we do, and then I do want to come on to why we believe the work that you're doing is so important for event owners like ourselves. So the European Championships, for those that don't know, is a multi-sport event that combines the existing European Championships we had 7 sports in our first edition in Glasgow in 2018, and we will go to 9 sports for the next edition in Munich, in the iconic Olympia Park, 50 years on since the 1972 Olympics. And we've got sports from the first edition: athletics, cycling, gymnastics, rowing and triathlon, and 4 new sports joining us this time: beach volleyball, sport climbing, sprint canoe and table tennis. So that brings us to 4,700 athletes. Obviously there's 50 nations in Europe, and we will have 177 medal events over 11 days of competition. But why the report is so important, because as Élise says, it's about the objectives of host cities and what are they trying to achieve from the event. And we designed the European Championships with host cities in mind, and what we wanted to achieve was a high impact of a major event without the huge price tag that normally goes with that. And we wanted to put this into a sustainable format that would appeal and be affordable for a much wider range of cities than some of the mega events. And for example, Glasgow is only the 67th largest city in Europe. So that shows that there's many cities across Europe that have the potential to stage an event like the European Championships. We've been able to keep the costs down to somewhere between 1% to 2% of an Olympic Games. And Glasgow came in at less than 20% of the cost of staging the 2014 Commonwealth Games 4 years before. But it's not about it's the cost; it's about the impact and the value for money that that this delivers, and it's against those objectives. And that's why, what I think your report is so important, Iain, because especially for the major events and almost for every international sport event now, it requires the support of governments at a local, regional and national level. And in Glasgow, we had the great support of the City of Glasgow and the Scottish Government. And in Munich, it's a joint funding decision between the City of Munich, the Bavarian government and the federal government of Germany. And because it's a public event, that means it's taxpayers' money that is being used, and therefore there's an accountability that the funders have towards the general public, and it is so important that decision to stage an event and the evaluation of the event is done on very objective criteria and a transparent means that is able to be compared to other forms of investment that the that the city might undertake. So in order to be credible, I think it needs two key elements. One is that you measure the right things. And second is that the analysis as an interpretation of that data is done in a consistent way, in an internationally recognized way. Because it's not just a case of taking the measurements, it's how you interpret those. So, for example, I can throw out some fairly impressive numbers to you that we delivered for Glasgow a media value of 256 million, or we delivered a direct economic impact for Germany of 144 million euros, or we created an equivalent of 1,300 full-time jobs in Berlin. But what does that mean? It's only meaningful if that data is actually reliable and is gathered from a trustworthy source and is analysed in a internationally acceptable way. Otherwise, we could be plucking figures from the air. So, I think your report is a fantastic first step in the direction. And if you'll permit me, Ian, I don't know, I've probably been talking for too long already, but I just want to raise one bugbear that I did raise in the consultation process about measuring impacts and how sports events are not consistent, and therefore it leads to a lot of confusion. So everyone's used cumulative TV audiences as a measure over the last 20, 30 years that I've been involved in this industry. And it's a great headline grabber. And I can tell you, we had 1.4 billion viewers as a cumulative TV audience. But that means nothing, because the way that measure is calculated is if 1 million people watched a 2-minute news insert of the marathon, that would be equivalent that you'd count 1 million towards that, and that would be 1 million that might have watched 2.5 hours of the marathon as a full coverage. So what we're pushing for, and we've adopted for our first edition, and we will continue this, and we encourage others to adopt a similar measure, is viewer hours, whereby one viewer hour is equivalent to one person watching for 1 hour. So if somebody watches a 5-minute news insert, that's only a 12th of the measure of somebody watching for a whole hour. And to tell you what that means for Glasgow and Berlin, we delivered 850 million viewer hours, which means that every man, woman and child of the 750 people in Europe watched at least 1 hour of the European Championships in 2018, and we hope to exceed that in 2022. But I think you can see that the statistics and economic impact needs to have a context for it to be relevant. And as we start our host city search for 2026, which we will be commencing early year, major part of our work is sitting down with the cities, understanding what their objectives are from hosting events, and seeing where there's a fit with what we can deliver. Does that meet their objectives? Then, of course, the research becomes essential from the previous events, that's done in a very transparent, consistent, clear way with the right data gathered, the right way of processing it in order to deliver that as information to future event hosts who are making very important decisions and making major investments in our sporting events. So congratulations once again on all the work, and keep it up. I think it's a fantastic first step, and love to be with you on the journey going forward.
Thanks, Paul. Yeah, I mean, and I'll grant you the permission to sort of dive into a bit of the detail there, just because I think what it does do is it illustrates the complexity of what lies behind some of these headline figures, and ultimately, what does it mean? How do we act, and what difference do we make? So just a little snapshot of that in Paul's example. Joel, finally, to you. I mean, that's very relevant to your experience and the work that you do now. I mean, you've sat around in public policy circles, about making tough choices about where government organisations or local government spend their money and what difference they seek to make. And you've actively been doing that now in the West Midlands with the strategy that you're developing as well. So how is the How is the objective of common indicators and the specifics of this report, do you think, overlap with what you do?
Yeah, thanks, Ian, and thanks for the opportunity to contribute to this discussion. And I think following on from Paul, who makes a really important point about, kind of consistency in measurement and meaning, and maybe just to touch on what Élise was saying about, taking a menu and actually using that menu of indicators to kind of fit local objectives. I'll try and kind of a bit of a kind of bridge between those 2 points, really. So just to give you a really very real practical example, as we were looking at the Commonwealth Games, and the Commonwealth Games was moving closer towards us back in 2019, would you believe? We produced this document. Birmingham were really keen to carry out a review of the economic, or really the impact of major events on the city. So we looked at about a dozen events, and would you believe, everything from events that were delivered by a kind of organising committee, Cricket World Cup, through to events delivered by an international federation in Diamond League Athletics, to national events and events that were owned by rights holders. And surprise, surprise, of those dozen events, there was zero consistency across what was being measured, but also the methodology they used. So it was kind of trying to compare apples and pears. So that kind of led to a conversation that said, look, we as a city need to be really clear with anyone who comes to the city and wants to hold an event, the types of things we would want to measure and the things that are important to us. And that led to us developing the major event strategy that went through formal committee approval in July this year. That's on the Birmingham City Council website for you to read. But we, in developing that strategy, we carried out a consultation across all of the stakeholders in the city, including, the kind of the 5 universities there, the local authority, voluntary community organisations, and the sports clubs and organisations, plus the other big venues in the city. And 2 things stood out from that. One was that we want this strategy, and we want major events to reflect our city. So, being welcoming, diverse, youthful, inclusive, innovative, that the events that we attract and host should meet with that. And some people may have heard me talk about our values yesterday. And then secondly, it was an opportunity to kind of reset and redefine. So Birmingham was a major city that is having weekly approaches by rights holders, major events organisers, governing bodies, who are promising the world around what their major events will deliver, but actually not being able to follow through with the evidence to show it once the event has happened. So I'll kind of cut it fairly short, but essentially what we then did is we took a menu of standard industry indicators, very much along the lines that you've developed, Ian, and I think you've taken what was event impacts and kind of moved it on a level. And I do think you've produced a fantastic report with a complete menu there of indicators. And we matched those indicators against the outcomes that the stakeholders and the city council was trying to achieve in terms of, a city that is entrepreneurial, aspirational, a great city to live in, and all of the kind of corporate outcomes that the city leaders were wanting to achieve. And then there was this kind of matching up with the indicators, with the aspirations, and then putting in place a process that would allow us at the start of a conversation with an event organizer to be really clear about how we would measure and evaluate success. And as you showed in your model, both before, during, and after post-event. And I suppose to end on a quote, one of the best quotes I've ever heard from a local authority chief executive. He said to me, "Joel, our budgets are massive. I've got tens of millions. I've just got too much to spend it on." And I think in the current climate, as we're coming out of COVID, the challenges that COVID has presented and the challenges to kind of local, regional and national government, I think there are the kind of outcomes are shifting for them as well. And I think as an industry, we need to respond to that. So I'll pause there.
Thanks, Joel. Yeah, very, very relevant. And I think as we've heard from all of the speakers, I think the timing is important to demonstrate some real tangible links between aspirational words and action on the ground and related to events. Élise, I'm just going to come back to you briefly. You mentioned your model. You mentioned you've been looking at indicators for a while now. Where do you see the consistency with what's published in here? I mean, there's a list of specific list of 80 input and output KPIs. Do you see them as being still valuable to be measured, and who do you expect to do that measuring?
Thank you, Ian. That's a good question. I mean, our model I've mentioned before is a little bit different, but our objectives are the same. Our benefit areas, we have 6 benefit areas, whereas this model has 5. We use assessment and descriptive data versus output, input, minor things like that. But ultimately, I think, we're both trying to achieve the same thing, and common vocabulary being, for us at the forefront. If we're all talking the same language, it'll make things just that much easier. And for us, when we started talking about, having a national model, that was the first thing, defining timelines. What's short term, what's medium term, what's long term? What does that mean? And, what does it mean? What are our benefit areas? What's a sport impact? What's a community impact? And so really having our vocabulary as the baseline. And if we could figure that, then we can build from there. And if we're all talking the same language, Joel's mentioned it, comparing apples and pears or apples and oranges, it's hard to do that. But if we're all talking the same language, that'll help all of us down the road. And so for us, we see, this report, and I didn't mention it earlier, but it's great. And for us, we see it as, our anchor, where we'll attach to that, and we'll build, together. And it adds value to the work that we've been doing, in our country. And it really shows that we're looking to do that, internationally, which is great. So for us, it might be, it's a different framework, but the objective at the end of the day is the same. We want to talk the same language, and we want to be able to tell the hosting story, across the country for us, but also internationally. So it's great. So,
Okay.
it's a bit different, but at the end of the day, we're trying to achieve the same things.
Okay, yeah, thanks. And just a reminder, everybody watching, please add a couple of questions, but keep adding any other questions into the chat, and I'll hopefully come to that. But Thomas, just briefly back to you. I mean, having heard some of the feedback here, and your colleagues in the federations, for example, some federations, World Athletics are going out of the way to make sure they start measuring the things listed here. I mean, what are your expectations? What do you think is realistic about what next with the detail that's been published?
No, I think it provides a good platform for us and many others to further develop the measurement methodology that we're using. There's many different people out there that have their own methodologies and how they want to measure this. And from time to time we go to a country that have their own methodologies, and we get numbers back that we can't really compare to other countries. So I think there's at least an opportunity for us to standardize things a little bit more across the different events we have. And as I said before, I think there's the outcome of educating and creating attention on these things for people to further develop their knowledge and further develop their strategies around their events, whether they are rights owners or hosts holding them. I think is the key of this report, rather than just the words that are printed in the paper here. I think the long-term outcome here will be a much more qualified set of events that will hopefully open the eyes for many other host cities and locations around the world also, that there's things to achieve from these kinds of sport events or other events that they are able to host.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, Paul, I mean, from your practical experience of Munich, coming up, what do you, as Thomas mentioned, people measure outcomes in slightly different ways. Sometimes they go to, academics, they may do a very detailed piece of work. On the other hand, there's some base information that an event gathers and can provide as the sort of the base level of information. What's the reality for you and forthcoming in Munich?
Well, the reality for us is that we're now at the stage where we're putting our research plans in place for what data we gather around the event in Munich, and clearly we have 9 European federations as stakeholders. We have EBU as our broadcaster partner, and all the broadcasters have their own objectives of what they're trying to achieve and measure through this event. And then you've got, the 3 funding partners, so Munich, Bavarian government, and the federal government of Germany. And maybe you could assume that their objectives are aligned, but obviously they're coming from a slightly different perspective. So it's, as the panel have said today, trying to identify what are the objectives of all of those stakeholders, and how do we measure the impact against those objectives. So it's complex, and it will be taking a large number of the indicators that you've got in the report. As somebody said, we won't be doing every single one, so we have to prioritize what are the more important measures that we look at. And what I take out of the panel this morning is you've got Joel and Élise basically coming in from a city perspective saying nothing existed, so we had to get a consistency, and they've developed their own way from a city perspective of analysing the 12 events that Joel talked about, and Élise was a much broader range across the whole of Canada. I would just love that there could be consistency across the whole of our industry, so that the things that we measure around Munich are, when we go to the next host city, we've measured the right things, and we're not missing into either Joel's or Elise's or whoever's methodology. We're then trying to tick the boxes or give them the data that they need to fit into their model, that we've actually achieved that, and that people are not asking for us for details that we haven't gathered this time around. And equally, we're not spending a lot of budget, resource and effort gathering things that are actually not useful to cities. So the more consistency we can get across the whole industry, I think the better it will be for everybody involved.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. I mean, interestingly, I'm monitoring a couple of the questions in the chat, and there's one from Mike Laughlin referring to sort of standards and how the sport industry sets those standards. So this is on that journey, and maybe in our wrap-up comments, I'll ask you to sort of figure out what the future might look like, and how do we move forward. But there's another question there, and Joel, I wanted to come to you. I mean, the question is about how are targets and goals of host cities shifting since COVID, particularly in the wider context, but also how it relates to events. And I'll tie additional tag onto that question about what do you expect events of different sizes to measure and demonstrate. You've got a very big event in the Commonwealth Games coming up next year, but you've also deal with an annual event in badminton, in Thomas's sport, that happens only over a few days. And what do you expect around monitoring against those shifting targets that are the question in the chat?
I'll try and join those 2 points together, I think, Iain. I think Thomas said something really important, and Paul actually just touched on it there, that no one event is the panacea for all the city's problems, and that we need just to be really clear about, events can only deliver specific impact and outcomes, not change the nature of the city. And I think, I think in a way, sport perhaps does itself a disservice in trying to sell the world to the city when it's pitching an event, So I think it's about being clear about what that event can deliver, And in that sense, no one event can do everything, but actually a collection of events, a rich calendar of events for a host city. Some will be about community participation and you can link it to health and well-being. Some events will be about TV audiences and high profile, kind of international audiences. Some will be more about, trying to just fill the venues and the facilities on a week-to-week basis that the host city needs to drive revenue. So, it's about looking at a calendar of events and a kind of stratified approach, a kind of tiered approach to major, minor, and kind of national events. Actually, an interesting aside, some of the national level events that kind of sneak under the radar deliver bigger return on investment than some of the major international events that are for the top 200 athletes or top, an audience of 5,000. Some of the kind of school events and national championships are over a week long with tens of thousands of parents and families coming into a city. So, it's how you actually, what's your definition of a major event, what impact you're looking for it to achieve, and how they all add together to create a kind of rich calendar of events, I think. But back to the start, Thomas's point at the start, let's not be shy around the sporting outcomes that events are still hoping to achieve for cities.
Yeah, thanks, John. A couple of other related questions, but a key one that is part of the storytelling about the value. What should events or rights owners or host cities do to share results openly or data openly? I mean, is it something that should happen more often? Is it something that's commercially sensitive? I mean, what are the issues around being able to sort of, if we have a consistent way of measuring some things, everybody openly sharing that, is that a good thing? Or should that happen more often? Joel.
Sorry, I'll hand back to the rest of the panel, but there was just one point at the end of that question, what's different after COVID? And I think we're framing the work around the Commonwealth Games as part of the social and economic recovery of the city. And, if you look at how the return to sport has driven people back into city centres and back into venues and, created, atmosphere again, thank goodness, after 18 months or a couple of years, then I think that's a really important consideration that major sporting and cultural events can stimulate engagement of communities. Sorry, I didn't want to miss that point. Back to your question.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah. I don't know who I'm looking at on the sort of wider question about sharing. Thomas, I don't know if you have a view on what you think is practical and realistic, what you'd be happy to share from your own perspective.
Yeah, I mean, I guess we have different things we do share also. I mean, we obviously always go out and brag about all the good things and what fits into the events profile our events have, and obviously we're happy to try and push our events, promote them, and tell about the strength we think we have. I think it for a wider audience, it needs to be up to each individual host events owner how much they want to share and how they want to do these things. It is a competitive world out there where data is used to promote yourself, but also is by others used to promote themselves if there's something they can do better. I mean, I think it's really up to, but obviously there will be an industry advantage if we are able to share some data here in terms of comparing and learning and how we are able to on a longer term develop the product of sport events overall, which is the business we're in here, to actually also put open the doors for more hosts being interested in sport events. There's many out there that are interested, and I think there's many more to come that we can make interested in being more active within sport events hosting if they learn more about the outcomes and what is really the values coming out of it. So I think sharing at some level is a good thing.
Okay, thanks. We've had a couple of questions being asked at the last minute, and I do want to leave time for you to sort of give a final remark. But maybe Élise, something for you. There's a question from UNICEF representative about interested to hear about the importance of social impact as part of the drive for more sustainable events, and another question related to the sort of practical applicability of indicators, for people that want to demonstrate that social link, whether the event's a local event or even an international event. Have you got a perspective on that?
Well, it's interesting because there's things that are very easy to measure, and there are others that are not. We've often talked about pride and how an event can increase the pride of a community, but how do you measure pride? So it's not always black and white. And I think as an industry, if we have, a consistent way to measure these things, it'll be that much easier to, again, going back to telling the story. And, so we may never be actually able to measure pride, but, we can find ways to tell the story around how proud, a certain country or a community was after an event. So, I think also Joel mentioned this earlier, but every event or every community will host for a specific reason. And one community may host multiple events, and every event will try to bring something different to the community. And so, diverse and inclusive events for us is at the forefront of our model. It has to be, diverse, and social impacts are definitely, seem to be gaining traction and being, more and more important for communities. So, but it's figuring out how do we measure that. And so finding ways to consistently measure it is important, I think, if we want to be able to tell the story and the impact that these events are having on the social side.
Great, thank you. Right, well, the clock is counting down. Thomas, I'll come to you, but I'll also give you the warning of maybe one last wrap up, and the vision of what success looks like from the idea of having common indicators in 3 or 4 years' time. What does success look like? Where is the industry then, and how do we move towards that? But Thomas, maybe you pick up on Elise's point, and if you want to touch on that as well, do.
No, I probably just wanted to touch on also about what is this report about. I mean, and you asked, well, should we share and compare? And I think that's a good thing. But let's also be honest. I mean, these things that we're talking about when measuring, as Élise said, I mean, how do you measure pride? I think you can measure pride, but it's very expensive to measure. It's around service and how you do it and so on. And let's be honest, for many maybe smaller event hosts, many of these measurements are maybe out of their range to actually do measurements on, because it takes quite a big budget just to measure these things. So I think we need to, again, I think the key of this report, and I think it's a very good one, is that there's lots of learning for whether you're big or small within the sports events industry, where we get a shared terminology, a better dialogue, and hopefully more attention and from many out there that wants to host our events, me being an events owner here. So it's not only about, how do we now have a big scientific measurement of all events and register that. It is really about the learnings and the strategies and at the end of the day, getting more sport events to happen out there.
And final comment from you, Joel, on what success looks like in 3 or 4 years' time, and what needs to happen now.
Well, I've just run down collaboration and co-creation, and I think, as somebody who spent 10 years in local government and then 10 years in governing bodies, I can see both sides of it. And actually, the answer is in the middle somewhere. Governing bodies can't be responsible for delivering all of the social outcomes in cities, and cities aren't the owners of the event that is promising all of these great things. So actually, somewhere in the middle is agreeing a set of indicators that we all sign up to, and each kind of put their intel into the bucket, and out of that we come out with a fantastic kind of result that gives both of the parties what they need. So I think it's about the application of these indicators and about collaboration. That's what I would advise people to think about.
Thanks. And Elise, final comment from you. I saw you nodding briefly on that point.
I agree. I couldn't agree more. I think, collaboration, it's the most important, really. And I think reporting on long-term, I've talked a lot about telling the story of hosting because that's at the forefront of our thinking, but being able to continue to report on some of the legacies, longer-term legacies of these events is so important because for major sport events, there'll be a host society that'll spend years developing and preparing for an event. And within 18 months after the event is over, that host society dissolves and a lot of knowledge and information is just disappears. And so how do we plan for reporting longer term? And I think if we can do that and continue to tell the story of the success of some of these events 10, 15 years later, I think we will have found success for sure. So that would be my concluding comments.
Thanks. And final word to you, Paul, as we wrap up.
Well, I'll keep it brief, but collaboration's been mentioned several times. Look, our event is all about collaboration. It's 9 European federations coming together to stage their event at the same time, same place, and working together to create those synergies and benefits. And as I said, we have broadcaster stakeholders, city stakeholders. If we can all work together and pool the resources around the research that is done around our events and share that, it's got to be good for everybody. Okay,
thank you, Paul. I think that's our time used up. I hope everybody's found that helpful and useful. And as I mentioned at the top, I recommend, as our panelists, do download the document. Hopefully you will find it useful, if nothing else, as a training and education tool, but hopefully more than that. And the final thing to say is it does say on the beginning, first edition. So if there's a second edition, if there's an improvement on it, and there's further work going on by other stakeholders like OECD, then I think we will be moving in the right direction. So that just leaves me to say thank you to Thomas, to Paul, to Joel, to Elise, and hand you back to Ben.